This is it. This is how this universe ends. No big final battle, no anything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Every time I watch this series, I always think, what if? And just thinking about it, along with how the other 90s Marvel animated series panned out, is really painful to think about. After the 90s series got cancelled, I can only assume that Avi Arad wanted to keep it going. So not only was he in the process of producing multiple live-action Marvel film projects, but he also commissioned a new Spider-Man animated series. Originally, it was going to be a low-budget adaptation of the first 26 Amazing Spider-Man comics. And while I like the idea of the original comics being adapted for animation, I don't like the idea that it was going to be low budget, and on top of that, 26? Why not stop at 28? Peter graduates high school in issue 28, so you could end your series there. While that was the plan, Sony and Marvel agreed to make a Spider-Man movie, which was deep in development hell around that time, but soon it would see the light of day. Saban, which was the company that wanted a new series, couldn't use the traditional sense of Spider-Man, so they improvised, and well, I'd like to discuss the first 2 episodes of the series in detail before reviewing the rest of the show. But we got what we got because Saban wanted a new Spider-Man series and weren't able to use the source material. So they created a new premise instead of not making it all together, as they decided to mix Spider-Man, who's normally a grounded street hero, and put him in a world with numerous cyberpunk elements. It was the 90s and a lot of people were paranoid about Y2K. If there were ever an era to mix Spider-Man with cyberpunk, this was the time. One last thing, I heard a rumor that this was originally supposed to be an adaptation of Spider-Man 2099 at one point. But I think what we ended up getting was a mesh of traditional Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2099. I'll point out why as I go along. The first episode starts off with Jameson going on a one-man mission to enter Counter-Earth, who attacked a probe that Earth sent. Just a couple minutes into the first episode, I already have a number of questions. Why just send one astronaut to investigate if they're hostile? Why not, send the Fantastic Four or the Avengers?
So long, sucker!
Jameson's still up there, alone with Venom and Carnage. Because I couldn't save him.
After that, we get a very Spider-Man situation, which I really liked how it was executed.
John!
Hey, wait a second. It isn't my fault. I was only trying to help.
Hold it, Spider-Man!
Surrender! Sorry, gentlemen, but I don't do surrender.
After John is supposedly killed by Venom and Carnage, Spider-Man naturally gets blamed by J. Jonah Jameson and puts a bounty on his head, resulting in the city's citizens blaming him despite looking out for them for years at this point. Spider-Man is cornered after saving a woman and a baby from a burning building, and this just sucks to see. After everything he's done for them, he gets treated like this. I've known this version for less than 10 minutes, but the characterization of this version is very much like the comics, and if there were one way for Spider-Man to go out, it'd be like this. And it's not in a super respectable, heroic way where he has a final battle with a villain to save the city. It was to save a citizen that assumed he's the bad guy, and in turn saves him anyway, getting buried by a building. Little kid me really thought he died. He was sad for a second there. But no, thank the one above all that he didn't, because he survives. And for a minute thinks about quitting as Spider-Man until Earth receives a transmission from John Jameson, who survives his encounter with Venom and Carnage. 6 months pass, and Spider-Man makes his triumphant return to save John. But this does pose another question I have. If Nick Fury was there for Solaris 2's launch, does that mean they were possibly going to send S.H.I.E.L.D. agents to counter Earth? The Fantastic Four? The Avengers? Because in all honesty, I wouldn't have minded if Spider-Man got some support instead of going completely by himself. Anyway, just to do a quick wrap up of the remainder of episode 1, and I wanted to also touch on episode 2, Spider-Man arrives on Counter-Earth with slight complications and gets stuck in the lengthy chase by that city's elite enforcers, the Knights of Wundagore. Okay, so don't tell me that Spider-Man 2099 didn't have a direct inspiration on this series. Flying cars, a world that's divided by levels, futuristic setting and tech, the comparisons are there. Anyway, after getting captured and then escaping because they wanted to attain a DNA sample, Spider-Man meets Counter-Earth's resistance and get him back in contact with John Jameson. After a short dialogue exchange, Spider-Man decides for the time being to join the war effort and lies low, staying with the Doctor and her son, vowing to get back to MJ someday. It's not a bad setup for 2 episodes. The first episode does a great job of setting up the main plot while at the same time still taking its time to get there, with the majority of the first episode taking place on Earth. The second episode sets up why this wasn't just a simple rescue mission and how things get more complicated. If you watched my 90s Spider-Man review, you'll know that that series ended on a cliffhanger. But this series is a loose continuation, having referenced 1 or 2 details from the series before it. So we can assume that this Peter found MJ and got married again to her. So in a sense, it's the same Spider-Man, and I'm willing to accept this in my headcanon. This Peter Parker is a lot like the comics. He doubts himself, he gets mopey, he's got the Parker intellect. He's your average Joe who no one would assume is a superhero. He's married and has probably lived with MJ for a few years at this point as they aged up the characters. As Spider-Man, he's got the quips, he's got the moves, and the ability to improvise in the middle of a fight. This Spider-Man carries what all Spider-Mans should carry: great power, great responsibility, which is the driving force of why he goes to Counter-Earth in the first place. And while this version of Spider-Man never lashed out in anger, and not many examples of him being a huge pessimist, how Spider-Man Unlimited portrays Peter is a decent representation of how he is in the comics. Not the best, but far better than what Sony Pictures and Disney thinks he should be.
Some things don't change. No matter where I go in the universe, everybody hates Spider-Man.
Aside from Peter, there's a few characters carried over from the source material, and then there's brand new characters altogether. I'll start with the character that started this all, John Jameson. The writers make good use of John Jameson as he has a background as an astronaut and in weaponry. A guy that can hold his own, so someone obviously did their research. This Jameson doesn't exactly have the respect for Spider-Man that the comics have, and we never did get to see him and Jonah interact, so I don't know if he ever had resentment for his father. When Spider-Man arrives at Counter-Earth, he's actually the leader of the Resistance. How he climbed up in the ranks in less than a year is beyond me, but I guess they needed a familiar face from the Spider-Man mythos to be top dog. Karen is one of the 4 supporting characters from the Resistance. She's tough and may have a thing for John Jameson, but aside from that and one plot detail that I won't spoil, this character doesn't have much going for her. I can say the same for Bromley and Git. Bromley's backstory is that he was one of the oldest Resistance fighters to remember a time before the war. He lost his brother and hoped to one day find him. He's also notorious among the Counter-Earth authorities. Git's backstory is tragic and it did make me sad. Though, because the character can't talk, he doesn't exactly have too much of a character and isn't really regulated to the background after the episode that focuses on him. Naoko and Shane Jones, the 2 that Peter stays with after arriving on Counter-Earth. Naoko is a doctor who's estranged from her husband, a member of the Resistance. Then one day he disappears, but is still alive due to him keeping tabs on Naoko, not liking that Peter's living under their roof. Shane is their son, who idolizes Peter after Peter saves him from a machine man. Neither of these 2 get much focus, but one likes Spider-Man, the other dislikes Spider-Man. I bet you can guess which one likes him and which one doesn't. Venom and Carnage are much like their comic book counterparts. Venom still holds a grudge against Spider-Man, but he isn't the biggest priority on his list, more like a bonus. This Carnage seems to be more reserved and focused on the Synoptic, and not really causing bloodshed because of his psychopathic tendencies. I know it's hard to adapt Carnage when it comes to children's programming, but they could have used a lot more than what we were given, and he could have been the wild card out of all the characters. Think about it, Venom and Carnage could have had a fallout, and boom, there you go. Counter-Earth Maximum Carnage storyline. The Knights of Wundagore are a mixed bag of villains. Ursula is easily the least developed of the four and just likes to fight, and not really reason with the targets that she's appointed. Lady Vermin is kind of like a counter-Earth Black Cat. She has a huge thing for Spider-Man despite not knowing if he's bestial or human. Spider-Man feels the opposite about her. Aside from that, there's nothing more to this character, but it does pose an interesting question. If she found out that he's human, would she still love him? Lord Tiger is the most respectable of the four, implying that he would like to coexist with humans through his actions and words. He's almost never seen fighting against the Resistance, and on numerous occasions has clashed with the other knights about how they handle things. Lord Tiger is definitely my favorite of the four. The most despicable of the four is easily Sir Ram. He experiments on humans, and as a young child, Git was one of those humans to be experimented on. He has the most antagonistic traits of the four, always ready to fight humans, and has failed numerous times trying to kill Spider-Man. And last, but certainly not least, the High Evolutionary, which is a villain we did see in X-Men the Animated Series, the one that started off this retrospective. Now, if you don't know too much about Cosmic Marvel, I occasionally dabble in it, so I know some stuff, but the High Evolutionary isn't an all-original character. How he's portrayed, maybe. In the comics, he's a human that has an intelligence that's on the same level of certain cosmic entities. He took an interest in Mr. Sinister's work, and in the comics he did indeed create a Counter-Earth. This version found Counter-Earth looking for a place to live in peace. He's a lot like his comic book counterpart, having a massive intelligence and his love of evolution, which created the Bestials, while also being well-mannered for the most part. The guy is very flawed, believing that humans are imperfect and shouldn't be the dominant species, while at the same time his creations are just as bad, experimenting on humans, and from what I was shown in the show, some Bestials have a deep-rooted prejudice against them. You wanted to get away from war by starting a war and race conflict. That's very counterproductive. This guy is supposedly seen as a genius for creating new specimen, but are you sure he isn't just a moron who discovered a new specimen? Because his plan, his reasoning is very flawed, and on top of that, the freaking cherry on top is that he thinks humans are beneath it all. Bitch, you are human! Or at least you look human. Don't talk to me about your heavily flawed philosophy, you damn hypocrite. If there were ever a villain that deserved the worst possible fate that I can think of, this version of the High Evolutionary is on that list. He gets zero sympathy from me. With all the characters I just listed off, there's a lot to work with, a lot of potential for interesting storylines and possible character arcs. I found a lot of the ideas to be very interesting, but the execution was lacking a lot of the time, as they never picked any one subplot to stick with, and it seemed like each individual writer was wanting to take the show in a direction that wasn't coinciding with the other writers' ideas. They gave us a number of subplots and very little payoff. Each character aside from Spider-Man got very little development and focus in the end, resulting with the show not having tight writing as there were so many plot lines that never got resolved. My advice would have been focus on 3 or 4 plot lines tops, but instead we had plot lines with each individual character that were introduced as the series went along, and despite everything I just said, I have to give some credit to the writers. The world building was decent. Spider-Man could have also had better quips.
Now what? The 4 horsemen of the ridiculous? Hey, what amusement park did you guys escape from?
I surrender. But be he human or bestial, 'tis certain that he is a valiant warrior.
Listen to Tony here. He's great!
Last time somebody ran away from me like that, she was my date at the junior prom. Who am I kidding? I didn't have a date for the prom.
One subplot that I would have liked to have gotten resolved is about Naoko's ex-husband, Hector. Why is Hector constantly hiding in the shadows and keeping tabs on them when he can just go visit them and make amends? Well, in the show it's implied that Counter-Earth Green Goblin is indeed Hector. Chances are he got experimented on and that's why he has a goblin-like appearance. What backs up this theory is that they said he was always in his shop working on gadgets and fought alongside with the Resistance. Somewhere in between, he had to have been kidnapped by Sir Ram and experimented on. That and the fact that Counter-Earth Goblin fights for the little people of Counter-Earth, and both Hector and Counter-Earth Goblin share the same voice actor, Rino Romano. I say that but in the tie-in comic of the same name, they confirmed that Hector is Counter-Earth Wolverine. It's never confirmed if this is canon to the animated series or not, even though they share the same art style and concept. So I'm just going to stick with my fan theory. Speaking of Rino Romano, he's one of my personal favorite Spider-Man voice actors. And despite the fact that he didn't have the best quips or scripts to work with as Spider-Man or Peter Parker, the characterization of the two was decent enough, and for some quips you'd think wouldn't work, he made it work. He's underrated and I think he deserves more credit. The rest of the cast is filled with mainly unknowns. At the very least, they're unknowns to me, but they did a good job. The only other voice actor that I know from the casting list is Jennifer Hale, who previously voiced Felicia Hardy, Black Cat. In this series, she voices Mary Jane Parker and Lady Vermin. The art style is my favorite of any comic book animated adaptation. Yes, it beats anything from the DCAU, X-Men the Animated Series, and Silver Surfer in my opinion, because it looks a lot like a comic book brought to life. The show occasionally has comic book text boxes show up when the location changes or to fill in the viewer of how much time has passed. That is a nice touch. Just look at the art style of the series. Is it not appealing to the eye? The shading is beautiful. The character designs are always on the mark. The only question I have is, why is Peter's hair red? And look at the suits! They gave Spider-Man a new design for the series. I think it might have been partially inspired by Spider-Man 2099's design. I know some people may hate the nanotech suit, but I personally love it, and the web cape, while not practical, is really cool looking too.
And it's a no on the cape.
I think it's cool.
Take that off, it's disrespectful. Spider-Man doesn't wear a cape.
And here I figured you were a low-fat kind of guy.
I would list off the features that the suit includes, but I'm going to have Spider-Man himself tell you.
Guess it's time for the world to get acquainted with the all-new, all-improved Spider-Man. This year's fully loaded model features nanotechnology, discreetly borrowed from the lab of Reed Richards. This scientific marvel features billions of microscopic robots working in harmony to make one spiffy set of duds, complete with optional anti-symbiote devices.
Another cool suit that wasn't on screen for very long, but we do get a third of the first episode in it, and some flashbacks in the suit. And this art style is the very first complete suit that Spider-Man ever wore. The Amazing Fantasy suit has never looked better. Oh my god! Minus the yellow lenses, which I have to say look really good, this is an almost direct design of the suit you see in Amazing Fantasy number 15, first appearance of Spider-Man. It pains me to see the suit torn to shreds, because it's a really good design. My favorite of all time. The third and final suit that Spider-Man wore, which was very brief, is the black suit. I don't want to say why he did, but they reunited for a common goal. And again, in this art style, it looks godly. The visual representation is one of the show's best aspects, and I wish they had gotten that direct adaptation of the Lee Ditko era of Spider-Man in this art style. It would have been my favorite had it happened. The soundtrack is yet another soundtrack from my childhood that I have no access to the original tapes. I wish I did because there's some underrated drums and bass tracks in there. Oh, I love the late 90s and early 2000s.
Kid! It's not what you think! Man.
Aside from mentioning the Fantastic Four a couple times, mainly Reed Richards, and a cameo from Nick Fury in the first episode, there's not much else to showcase from other corners of the Marvel Universe. There's probably some of you wondering why this series is buried and not really well known or remembered. Well, when you break it down, it's basically Blade Runner meets Planet of the Apes with Spider-Man mixed in. I'm sure, and I mean I'm 99% sure that this series was also commissioned not just because they wanted a new Spider-Man animated series, but also because they wanted to compete with Batman Beyond, which had just premiered 8 months earlier. You can't tell me that it's a huge coincidence that both of each respective comic book publisher's biggest IPs were going cyberpunk in the last year of the 90s. The problem is that Batman Beyond had a lot more going for it. It came out first. It had a better premise. It was part of one animated continuity that had been going since 1992, and it was still going strong when it premiered. had better animation, less censorship, and if I'm being honest, Kids WB was the it channel for children's programming around that time, and took the crown from Fox Kids just a couple years prior. Fox Kids, on the other hand, didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of the end for them, and that's not even the worst part. They tried to compete with Batman Beyond, but Batman Beyond won out because the first episode of Unlimited aired when Batman Beyond was already a few episodes deep into its second season, and it was created at the wrong time. Because the last nail in the coffin was the anime boom of the late 90s and early 2000s. I know this because I was there. It began airing at the same time that Pokemon and Digimon came out with their English dubs. And yeah, I remember that Pokemon was huge for the next few years, and had it not been for Pokemon, a number of animated series would have never gotten cancelled. Digimon was overshadowed by Pokemon, but still had a sizable fan base for the first couple years, and both overshadowed Spider-Man Unlimited immediately. Now, I was never really into Pokemon aside from the games. I watched a few episodes as a kid, maybe had a plushie or two given to me as a birthday present. The only thing I remember about Digimon is the intro, and that's it. I never watched a single episode. I was probably one of the few that didn't hop on the bandwagon for either Pokemon or Digimon. I loved superheroes as a kid, and I still do now. When it comes to anime, I didn't get into anime through Kids WB or Fox Kids. I got into it through, you guessed it, Toonami.
The time has come.
I know, Bubbles, yes, I can feel it too.
See, those two anime were for children. Even at 3 years old, I sort of knew that. I wanted to watch something far more action-packed, and I wanted violence and darker stories. And I got that with Dragon Ball Z and Cowboy Bebop.
It's okay to hurt. It's okay to feel the rage. Harness it. Use it as a tool. There is no end for me. No end.
And I knew I would get that with superhero shows too, but other kids my age and a little older were more concerned about fads, and superheroes weren't a fad at the time. Pokemon and Digimon were. It wasn't until a couple years later, when the first Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie came out, that superheroes returned permanently to the general public's attention. And as for this series being buried by 3 other shows, well, it was actually cancelled after airing just 3 episodes, because the Fox Kids executives saw what a ratings behemoth anime became, so they cancelled Spider-Man Unlimited after 3 episodes and probably put Digimon in its time slot. After things calmed down a little bit after a year and a half, Fox Kids aired the remaining episodes that they had in holding, which resulted in one of the biggest cliffhangers that have yet to be answered from my childhood. What happens next? Well, we're never gonna find out. I feel bad for all those involved in the show's production, because it seemed like the second that it aired, no one gave it much of a chance, ending in a quick cancellation. This is Larry Brody's 3rd Marvel animated series that he wrote for, and the 3rd one that got cancelled. I feel for him. There were scripts for a 2nd season written, one of which is where Spider-Man supposedly returns to Earth. Can I see those scripts, please? Not only is it another Spider-Man series that got cancelled before it could finish telling its story, but it's also another 90s Marvel animated series that got cancelled before its time, and the last of its era. The only one that you can say that finished telling its story on its own terms is the first of the bunch, X-Men the Animated Series. Technically, you could say that the Fantastic Four and Iron Man animated shows finished its story, but those got cancelled on a triumphant note. They wrapped up all of their respective seasons' plot lines before they left the network. Now, normally, I'd be like Peter and wallow in my sorrow. I'm not gonna do that, because even though that era of Marvel shows ended on the lowest point possible, and it was probably expected me to end this retrospective on a downer note if you knew of Spider-Man Unlimited's ending. But no, not this time. I have a remedy for this. These 2 PS1 games have the same voice actor from Spider-Man Unlimited, Rino Romano. And in a headcanon, you could say that he helped the humans win the war, cleared his name, and got back home. And there you have it. Not the best ending for this universe, or most conclusive ending, but it's an ending that mirrors the comics in a way that life just goes on for the Marvel Universe. And the adventures will always continue. Anyway, I got off topic there for the last few minutes, or however long I ranted on for. I will give Spider-Man Unlimited a recommendation to Spider-Man fans only. And if you're just a casual viewer of Marvel, then I'd say give the first couple episodes a shot. And if you're interested, watch the remaining 11 episodes that come after. While this is the last show that I'll be reviewing from the 90s era, this isn't the ending, true believers and newcomers alike, as I wanted to wrap up my thoughts on this universe as a whole in a separate video, which I will get working on very soon. I'm Lena Mars of the MMCA Productions crew, and I'll see you in part 8.